Hey everybody, welcome back to EMS1 News. Ed Bauter and Dan Schwester from the Overrun, and today we're going to talk about this case out of Indiana. 26-year-old Rhyker Earl, a known seizure patient, was seen by EMS earlier in the day, and then later in the day called 911 again for seizures. As he was postictal, it sounds like he fell into a police officer, at which point the police began to prone and restrain the patient. He was proned into a pillow. EMS gave him 3 separate doses of some sort of sedative. We don't know which one yet. And after this treatment, this patient eventually was found by the family to be blue and to not be breathing. And eventually Rhyker Earl was transported to the hospital where he was pronounced. We did speak to the attorney in this case, and he gave us some of the details. But essentially what has happened is EMS was called, the patient was postictal, and we all know what postictal patients can act like. It sounds like he fell into a law enforcement officer. The law enforcement officer took exception to this. And this is when all this went down. But Danny, again, we seem to be in a place where someone called 911 for help and they ended up dead at the end of the call.
Yeah, the press release is disturbing. I'm surprised, honestly, that more news agencies aren't picking up on it as of yet. It's another example of things that went horribly wrong. And it's important to remember, while we're in the early phases of an investigation, the red flags are jumping out off the paper at you. Again, we have someone who's altered, maybe not acting appropriately or politely, as we'd say. And we know postictal patients do this. Again, another patient with a history of a reactive airway disease or respiratory illness, asthma in this case, getting put into a prone position and being handcuffed. We know that's a dangerous position. It's almost, at this point, we need to regard that as almost deadly force. And being sedated by unknown agents, by, I would assume, a paramedic. We're doing this again. I'm stunned that we are back in this position again, and we are going to go through this whole thing over and over again until we start learning as an industry that we can't do this. We can't always control law enforcement. We've written about this. We've talked about this, but we have to control ourselves and we have to do what's right for the patient. And, you know, I hope there's some extenuating circumstances coming out of this, but again, red flags all over the page, screaming at me, telling me that, again, we have another dead young person because we didn't see the big picture.
And according to this press release, it sounds as if Rhyker Earl was being restrained for at least 15 minutes. And I have to reinforce, this was done in front of the family. The family was actually the ones who noticed that Rhyker Earl was not breathing, which is horrifying for its own reasons. But again, coming from this press release and coming from the attorney is Stephen Wagner, rather. This conversation, it sounds as if that this patient was being held by law enforcement. Treatment was actually sort of withheld for some time, again, being prone for 15 minutes, and he was taken off of life support 2 days after the actual treatment occurred. So this is one of those stories where we don't know if this was the medications that were involved, if it was the proning that was involved, and it is an ongoing investigation. But I guess the biggest question is, what can we learn from this? And Danny, you and I have talked about this off air, but this is another situation where if you're working in EMS, it's becoming more and more obvious that this is something that we have to intervene with. So if you see a patient who is being mistreated, who's being prone, who are being put into danger positions, it sounds like EMS is starting to have to kind of step up in those situations.
Yes, and I think the courts are holding that. The early release of one of the paramedics in the Elijah McClain case this week, notwithstanding, you will be held criminally and civilly responsible for the care of your patient while you're there and taking care of them. You will be held to account. What law enforcement is doing, and I'm saying this as a retired law enforcement officer and paramedic, not our concern. It's not our job to act in that manner. And I know we've traditionally had this kind of close relationship with law enforcement, but we have to think of the patient first. And in these instances, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing, I'm just not seeing it. We understand that law enforcement's a difficult job. We're not going to sit here and, we're not getting into the political ramifications of this. You got to remember, when police are using force, it's an extremely dangerous incident for not just them necessarily, but also for the person that they're using force against, regardless of the reason. And this is a potential problem for your patient. Number two, you are not law enforcement. You are not the judge, and you are not the jury. Stop it. Take care of the patient. Look out for their welfare, because you will be held accountable later on down the road in the court of public opinion, in the civil court, and in the criminal court.
And surely when we go out into the field, we all know, whatever platitude you'd like, the time is always right to do the right thing, is the one that kind of comes to mind for me. And it seems that this is a situation, again, the Swiss cheese model. A lot of things went wrong in this particular situation, but we're following this story. We're going to keep this developing as the story comes out. There's going to be some news stories on WGN about this particular story, but be sure to follow the Overrun on YouTube and get your podcast from there. We'll talk more about this at overrunems.com. And for the Overrun, Ed Bauter and Dan Schwester, and we'll talk to you next time.